are days when time folds in on itself, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a hush, so quiet. It only bends for the person who remembers. That morning, as light filtered through the office blinds in strips too narrow to warm anything, she stepped into the reception area with the kind of quiet presence that doesn't ask to be seen, but cannot help being felt. Her blouse was pressed, her posture exact, and there was a stillness to her face that made me blink more than once. Not out of confusion, but out of recognition I didn't yet understand. I watched from the admin office, half shadowed by a rusting file cabinet, pretending to organize a stack of invoices that hadn't moved since Thursday. She said her name softly to the front desk, and though I couldn't hear it clearly, my body responded before my mind did. There was a tension in my spine that hadn't existed moments earlier, a tightening in my hands I hadn't willed. Something about the curve of her cheek, the pause before she signed the onboarding sheet, the way her left foot angled slightly inward as she stood. These were not unfamiliar things. These were the kinds of things you only notice in mirrors, in photographs you've hidden in drawers, in children you once imagined naming but never held. She didn't glance my way, nor should she have. I was nobody, an office assistant 2 doors down, older than most, invisible by design, and yet, as she turned to follow the HR coordinator down the hall, her face caught the light in such a way that my breath misfired. Not because she looked like someone I knew, but because she looked like someone I had lost before she ever became real. There was no drama in her presence, no cinematic music swelling in the background, and yet I felt the floor grow thinner beneath me. I gripped the edge of the desk not because I was faint, but because the past had tilted the room, and I was the only one left remembering where it used to stand. When I passed her later near the printer, she nodded with the polite distance of someone raised to respect but not invite. I returned the nod, but the air between us pulsed, up close. The details became louder, the small freckle on her collarbone, the way she bit the inside of her cheek before speaking, the clipped rhythm of her shoes on tile. All of it made me ache in places I thought had long been sealed shut. She tucked her hair behind her ear, not casually, but with the exact same motion I had made for years without ever teaching anyone. Moving in a gentle clockwise sweep, her middle finger leading the curve as her elbow lifted slightly, as if muscle memory could somehow travel through bloodlines without ever needing to pass through voice. I sat back down at my desk, unsure if what I felt was fear, guilt, or something older, something with no name but infinite weight. The screen blurred. My fingers hovered above the keyboard without moving. For the rest of the afternoon, I heard her laugh once in the break room, short, controlled, not from the gut, and it was like hearing my own voice in a dream I couldn't wake from. I told myself it was coincidence, told myself resemblance means nothing, told myself the dead don't return in button-down shirts and onboarding packets. But that night, when I stood brushing my teeth and caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw her, not the woman from the office, but the version of me that once believed I could keep the past in a box and never meet its eyes again. And suddenly, the face looking back wasn't only mine. It never had been. Hospitals aren't made to hold stories. They're built for function, for codes and charts and fluorescent silence, not for memory. I was 19 when I arrived under a name I never intended to keep, carrying nothing but a secret I had already been told not to speak. The intake nurse looked at me the way people look at routine, with politeness, with detachment, and I gave her just enough for the forms to be processed and the door to stay open. He was a man of authority, not just at work, but in the way people paused when he entered a room. Older, married, careful. He didn't yell when I told him I was pregnant. He didn't plead. He simply looked at me and said, in a voice carved by years of clean exits, This doesn't leave this room. From that moment on, I stopped imagining outcomes, not because I didn't want one, but because his sentence had already ended every version of my story. The final month blurred. I worked as long as I could. I hid in plain sight. I told no one. And when the time came, I took a cab, paid in cash, entered through the emergency wing, and gave them a contact number with one digit wrong. I signed a form with a borrowed name. The labor passed as if my body had rehearsed it alone, clean, wordless, predetermined. And when they handed me the child, I held her just long enough to feel something ancient stir beneath my ribs, something too large for words but too brief to root itself. The birth unfolded with the efficiency of a well-practiced routine, quiet, medical, untouched by sentiment. And though the nurses offered small gestures of softness, their kindness held the subtle distance of those who had learned to treat the vanishing as inevitable. I left through the service stairwell without turning back, and no one followed, no one called out. Not because they didn't care, but because they simply had no idea who I had ever been to begin with. By morning, the hospital searched protocol, not memory. There was no matching ID, no confirmed address, no emergency contact to reach. The child remained in the nursery, stable beneath the monitors, breathing in the rhythm of the unnoticed, and wrapped in a silence so complete it felt less like absence and more like abandonment waiting to be named. Her file listed only the hour she arrived and the phrase, "no maternal data." She was swaddled in a blanket with no name, placed in a bassinet by a nurse who didn't look twice. 2 days passed before a doctor noticed the file hadn't moved. He was older, semi-retired, the kind who walked slowly but remembered quickly. He paused beside the child without speaking, without asking, and returned the next day with a folded blanket and a name handwritten in the corner of a note card. He didn't ask for custody. He didn't alert the board. He simply waited. And when no one came, he remained. He never submitted paperwork, never claimed guardianship, never asked to be acknowledged. But when the hospital's efforts to reach a next of kin failed and the system began preparing to assign her a number, he stepped forward, not with declaration, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had already decided that this child would not be forgotten. He didn't discover her. He chose to hold her place when the world left it empty. The file was marked and closed without further questions, and a man who had once buried a daughter, years earlier and in silence, became a father again. Not through law or ritual, but through an act of presence so still it almost looked like routine. There were birthdays where the only voice singing came from a playlist I'd forgotten to turn off, and holidays where the sound of my own breathing filled the corners of rooms meant for laughter. Aging didn't arrive with ceremony, but with slow subtraction. One less invitation, one less reason to leave the light on, one less name said aloud at the end of the day. And so I adapted, not with bitterness, but with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to make space for absence without calling it pain. I never remarried, not because love was unreachable or absent from the world around me, but because over time, slowly, silently, I had come to believe that I had forfeited the right to be chosen again, as though that one early decision had quietly closed the door on every other version of the life I might have lived. I filled my days with structure, with lists and forms and systems that never asked me who I had once been outside their margins. It was easier that way, easier to be needed for what I did than missed for who I was. At the office, people knew me as the kind of person who arrived before the lights fully warmed up, who submitted reports before being reminded, who remembered birthdays without needing a calendar. In other words, efficient, on time, reliable, but none of them ever noticed that I sometimes lingered near the copy machine just to hear it say my name out loud, because in a building full of voices, that mechanical utterance was often the only time I felt acknowledged without being needed. In the evenings, I moved through my apartment with careful rhythm, water the plants, reheat the soup, sort the mail. The hallway light stayed on long after it was needed, and I told myself it was habit. But deep down, I knew it was something else. It was a ritual for the unseen, a signal not for others, but for the version of myself I had once hoped might return. That version had a name, but it was never called. That version had arms ready to open, but no one ever knocked. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined her, not as a face, but as a presence, a young woman somewhere in the world, walking with the same uneven pace I had as a girl, tucking her hair behind her ear in the same way I did when I was nervous, moving through spaces that never told her she had been given up. I didn't wish for a reunion. I didn't dream of redemption. I simply wondered if a piece of me lived somewhere I could no longer reach. And then, one day, in the narrow corridor that stretched between two departments, I had walked through more times than I could count. She passed by without ceremony, without recognition, without even a pause, just a presence so quietly familiar that the moment pressed itself into my skin before I had the language to name it. I didn't call her name, and I didn't take a step forward. Not because I was frozen, but because something deeper than memory was unfolding inside me. Not as a scream, not as a shock, but as a quiet clarity I had spent decades keeping buried beneath silence that had once felt safer than truth. In that moment, I didn't need her to turn around, didn't need a title, didn't even need recognition, because what passed between us required none of those things to be real. Silence. I realized. Isn't the absence of memory? It's the space that holds it when words are too small. She continued down the corridor, her steps steady, unaware of the storm she had left behind, while I stood there with a stillness I hadn't known could feel so alive, and for the first time in a lifetime, shaped by invisibility and quiet endurance. I wasn't waiting to be called or claimed. I was simply standing in the truth of having been seen, not recognized by name, but remembered by something older than language. By someone who didn't know they were looking for me. It happened in the hallway between the copier and the break room, a place more familiar than my own kitchen, where people passed without thinking and names blurred into job titles. One moment she was walking, balancing a stack of folders, her shoulders as still as ever. The next, she was on the floor, her body folded inward, as if something had given out from the inside before anyone could notice. No scream, no warning, just a sound, soft, sudden, like fabric falling from a table. I moved before I thought, which is how I knew it wasn't thinking that guided me. Others stood closer, younger, quicker to react, but somehow my hands reached her first. Her pulse was faint, her breath scattered like leaves in wind. I called emergency, gave her name, listed her department, confirmed her hire date, all while pressing my hand to the center of a life I had never been allowed to hold. At the hospital. The fluorescent light pressed down harder than the silence. Nurses moved around her with brisk precision, noting vitals, checking reflexes, speaking in codes meant to shield meaning from emotion. I stood at the edge of the room, neither visitor nor family, not expected, not questioned. Her emergency contact didn't pick up. The number on file rang unanswered. The attending nurse turned to me, voice flat but professional, and said they needed someone related to provide a blood sample, just to verify compatibility. In case a transfusion became necessary, the nurse explained that a relative's sample was needed. Something about group verification, standard precaution, nothing unusual, and I didn't question it, didn't speak. Only nodded and followed her into a windowless room where the air felt sterile in ways beyond cleanliness, and the chair was cold enough to remind me I was not meant to stay. She took 2 vials, labeled them quickly, and handed me a clipboard I signed with the steadiness of someone who hadn't written anything personal in years. She thanked me without looking up, and I remained in that chair long after she left, my arm tingling, not from the needle, but from the quiet, thick, absolute, as if silence had found form in the walls themselves. They kept her under observation through the night, and by morning, her vitals had stabilized. At work, no one questioned why I had been the one to act, why I had stayed past visiting hours, or why I sat outside her room with hands folded, not praying, not hoping, just remembering something that had once almost belonged to me, and now stood only inches away, separated by time, glass, and everything that had never been said. The next afternoon, a doctor approached with the kind of look that doesn't ask questions, not clinical, not warm, just precise. He mentioned the lab had flagged something, an anomaly, a deeper than expected match. He used words like alignment and unexpected overlap. I asked to see the paper. He paused, then handed it over. The word match landed first, then a code, maternal. Then a silence that felt like a name returned without sound. No one else read the result. No one else needed to. I folded the paper with deliberate care, once along the middle, once again at the edge, and placed it into the lining of my coat like someone folding a map they would never use but could never discard. I walked back to the waiting room with the kind of stillness not born from shock, but from something older, the end of a question that had never been asked aloud. When she opened her eyes, her gaze held mine for half a second too long, not in confusion, not in recognition, but in the strange pause of someone who senses they are no longer entirely alone in the room. She didn't speak. I didn't either. There was no need. Some truths do not arrive with sound. They don't demand belief. They simply stand still until they are felt. I brought the envelope home, unopened, holding it the way one holds something not yet real, something that might change form if acknowledged too soon, folded tightly, resting between my fingers like a pulse I wasn't ready to read. I didn't break the seal until hours later, not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I already knew what it would confirm. And part of me needed to delay the moment that knowing would become permanent. The paper unfolded slowly, its creases still firm, the ink still sharp. I scanned just enough to see the line that mattered. Maternal match, confirmed. The words were stripped of flourish, absent of warmth or tenderness, not written to move, but simply to record, as if truth required no poetry to be final. Something inside my chest shifted, not with force, but with quiet finality, like a drawer opening after years of being stuck. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where unpaid bills had once piled beside dinner for one, and laid the page flat beside an untouched cup of tea. Around me, the house moved like usual, the clock ticked, the fridge hummed, the walls breathed without concern, but I didn't move. The paper stayed beneath my hands, and I stared at it the way someone stares at a photograph they've never taken but somehow recognize. I didn't reach for the phone, didn't rehearse a speech in my head, and certainly didn't cry. Not because I felt nothing, but because what I felt had no shape words could hold. Instead, I sat still, holding the page with both hands as if it were a thread I might pull or a wound I might press closed. Because the truth, once spoken, cannot be taken back, and even in its silence, it carries the weight of all the time it was left unsaid. I thought of going to her. I imagined what I might say. I pictured a doorway, her face, my voice, but none of it landed. None of it felt truer than the fact that this paper, this small, typed confirmation, now existed between us, and it said more than any confession I could offer. I had left, she had lived, And now we had arrived at the place where past and present no longer pretended to be strangers. Some truths do not arrive with sound or struggle. They unfold quietly within the body, resting there until the moment they are felt without ever being asked for. I folded the result again, this time with care, not to erase it, but to protect what it had returned to me. Not closure, but clarity. I tucked it into the drawer beneath the hallway lamp, the one that always stayed on, though I had long told myself it was habit or safety or routine. But I knew, in that moment, it had never been about safety. It was never just a light left on. It was a signal to the part of me that had never stopped hoping, the part that believed if the truth ever came home, I would be ready to stand still and receive it. The cafe was quiet, not sacred or solemn, just the kind of quiet built from low conversation, soft clinking of cups, and the mutual agreement among strangers not to intrude. She had chosen the place. I accepted without asking why, arriving early enough to sit by the window, wrapping both hands around a cup that had long gone cold, as if holding warmth from memory might prepare me for what hadn't yet begun. She arrived exactly on time, her steps steady but unhurried, carrying the same composed posture I had noticed the first day we met, the bearing of someone who had learned not to expect kindness, but moved through life as if dignity could substitute where softness was withheld. She didn't hug me or smile. She simply sat, folded her coat, and met my eyes with the quiet deliberation of someone studying an unfinished sentence, not to complete it, but to understand why it had been left open. We didn't speak at first. The silence wasn't heavy, only undecided, like a space waiting to learn whether it would become a bridge or a wall. When she finally asked, her voice was calm and clean of accusation. "Why didn't you come back?" The question didn't strike like blame. It arrived like weather, gentle, steady, inescapable, and carried no heat, only history. I didn't break or explain. I took in a single breath, the kind that asks nothing but carries everything, and let the truth emerge, not for defense, not for sympathy, but simply because it had lived too long without being said. I told her about being 19, about the man with a title and a closed door, about the instructions that left no room for dreaming. I spoke of the hallway that had passed for a birthing room, of leaving without a name, and of how grief, when folded tight enough, begins to disguise itself as survival. I didn't ask her to understand or forgive. I didn't even ask her to listen, though she did, fully, silently, with hands resting on the table like anchors in still water. She offered no reaction, no nod, no visible shift, but something imperceptible in her expression loosened, as though the distance between us had stopped trying to defend itself. We remained at that table longer than the tea required. She stirred hers twice and never drank it. I folded and unfolded a napkin as if repetition could fill in missing years. When the check came, she reached first. I didn't stop her. As we stood to leave, she said nothing to name me, no title, no address, not even a parting phrase, but she paused beside me long enough to leave something behind, not a word, not a gesture, just a stillness that no longer felt resistant. And in that moment, I didn't feel recognized or forgiven, only allowed. There was no reunion to mark, only the return of something still alive. No name was spoken, but a chair had been shared, and what was broken had begun to quietly stay. She hadn't asked to meet again, but I had. Not because I was seeking answers or closure, but because something within me needed to speak without expecting a reply, and somehow I knew she was the only one who could hold that kind of silence. We chose the park, or maybe the season chose us. Early autumn, when trees do what they always do, release what's no longer theirs, quietly, without ceremony, without seeking permission. I brought 2 sandwiches folded in a paper bag, just like the ones my father used to pack on clinic mornings. with the crusts trimmed off and saved for birds that always seemed to know where to wait. We sat at a bench near the pond. She didn't ask why we were there or what this was meant to be. She simply took her seat beside me, folded her coat across her lap, and kept her eyes still. Which, that morning, felt like more than enough. I told her about the man who had raised me, who taught me to tie shoelaces not by correcting mistakes, but by telling stories that made the loops mean something. He once said, "Every knot is just a promise under tension." He never made me feel like I was replacing someone he'd lost, even if I believe now that he had. And though he wasn't warm in the way people usually mean that word, he was present. And over time, presence becomes its own kind of comfort. I told her about the woman I had called mother, not because of biology, but because she was there through the scraped knees, the report cards, the quiet cries at night when nothing else made sense except the hum of her voice bleeding through the wall. She braided my hair on picture day every year, even when I insisted I could do it myself, and she was the first to teach me the difference between being silent and being silenced, a lesson I didn't understand until I needed it. I didn't glorify their sacrifices, didn't elevate them beyond what they were. I simply told her that they stayed, in the moments that mattered and the ones that didn't, even when I rejected them, even when I thought needing anyone made me weaker. They never declared themselves essential, they just were. And sometimes, just being is enough to shape a life. When I looked at her, the woman whose hands I carried without ever holding, I told her, not as revelation, but as recognition. I never felt like something was missing, but now I understand why the quietest parts of me always felt like they were waiting to be named. She didn't interrupt or respond. She just listened in the way old trees do, unmoved, unbending, but somehow still absorbing every word without bending closer or pulling away. When I finished, she glanced out at the water, her expression unreadable, though I sensed she was holding what I said with both gentleness and caution, as if even kindness could bruise if grasped too tightly. I reached into the bag and handed her the sandwich I had made, and she took it with both hands, more careful than she needed to be, as if what passed between us might break under too much weight. And then I said, not asking, not claiming, but simply offering what had become true inside me. I didn't grow up without a mother. I grew up with two. I just didn't know the name of the first one. Until now. When she looked at me, it wasn't surprise I saw, or sorrow, or forgiveness, only a kind of presence that didn't require language to be complete. I smiled, not because anything had been healed, but because something had been acknowledged, and it hadn't disappeared under the weight of being seen. We didn't set another meeting. We didn't name what we had just shared. But when we stood up and walked in separate directions, we moved as if the space between us no longer needed explanation, not quite together, but no longer apart. The invitation came in the form of a message, short, without ceremony, just a date, a time, and an address I had never seen. No mention of what it was for, no instructions, no expectations. And yet, something in the simplicity made it feel heavier than it looked, as if the unspoken words around it had chosen restraint over rehearsal. I arrived a few minutes early, the way people do when they're not sure if they should come at all. The house was modest, with a blue porch light and a wind chime that didn't move, though the wind had already started to shift. I stood at the bottom of the steps longer than I needed to, holding a small tin of tea leaves wrapped in brown paper. Unsure if it was a gift or an apology, she opened the door with a nod. No smile, no surprise, just a quiet recognition that I was the one who had received her message and chosen to show up, inside. The lights were soft, the table already set. A place had been made for me. It wasn't at the head, but it wasn't to the side either. It was simply there. A chair with a plate, a glass, and a cloth napkin that matched the others. The man who had raised her stood to greet me. He was older now, smaller than the memory I had imagined, with a voice that didn't reach as far as it once might have, but still carried clarity. He didn't call me anything, didn't mention the past, didn't ask how I'd been. He just gestured toward the table and said, "We're glad you could make it." His wife, the woman who had been mother in every day I wasn't, placed a bowl of steamed vegetables at the center, then offered me a serving spoon without needing to speak. No one went out of their way to make it easy, but no one made it harder than it needed to be, and that, more than anything, felt like mercy. We ate in near silence, the kind that doesn't rush to fill space, the sound of forks, the passing of plates, the polite way chairs creaked as we shifted our weight. It all became a kind of quiet music, the only kind we knew how to play together. I didn't reach for more than I needed. I didn't try to impress or insert myself. I just followed the rhythm of the room, as if learning a dance I had once known but forgotten. She chose the seat directly across from me, not to create distance, not to claim closeness, but to hold a position that felt intentional, measured, and quietly aligned. At one point, she refilled my glass without asking, as if hydration could be its own form of belonging. Later, when the salt was out of reach, she passed it before I noticed I needed it, and somewhere between the last bite and the silence that follows a shared meal, she looked at me, not with declaration, not with hesitation, but with a stillness that told me, "You're not here by accident. We didn't take photos, didn't raise glasses, and no one offered words meant to be remembered." But when she rose to clear the plates, her hand paused on the back of my chair, not to guide or dismiss, but simply to rest where distance had once lived. It wasn't a homecoming, but neither was it a visit. It was a presence quietly recognized without ever being defined. When I left, no one followed me to the door, and I didn't expect them to. But as I stepped onto the porch, I glanced through the window and saw her setting down the kettle I had brought, the one she hadn't touched all evening, and I understood, without a word, that she would steep it tomorrow, and that, for now, was enough. There was no formal invitation, no envelope bearing my name, no seat assigned, no role offered, but I knew the date, I knew the place, and more than that, I knew I would go, not to be seen, not to belong, but to stand quietly at the edge of something I had once walked away from. 2 years had passed since the first meal. We never called each other, never labeled what we were rebuilding. But there were signs. A tin of tea left at my door, a book I returned without a note, only a ribbon marking a page, on her graduation. She sent me a photograph of her cap, turned away from the camera, and once, during flu season, I received a message. "Do you still have that ginger recipe?" So when a young woman, someone I'd never met, approached me in the back hallway of the venue and said, "She asked if you could come upstairs." I followed, heart steady but hands unsure. The room was filled with morning light, soft and even, spilling across a white dress not yet closed. She stood facing the window, shoulders bare, calm in a way that made the silence feel chosen. She didn't turn, she didn't explain. She just said, "Could you help me button the back?" The dress was clean, quiet in design, no lace, no shine, only fabric that asked to be handled slowly. My hands trembled once, then steadied as I placed a finger beneath the first button, then another, the row running down her spine like a sentence being written in reverse. I moved with care, not just for the dress, but for the years between us, for the weight of being invited to touch something that was never mine to hold, yet now had no resistance. Halfway through, I glanced up at the mirror. She was watching her own reflection, not me, her expression unreadable but still. I didn't speak, neither did she, but in the space between our hands and the silence that held them, I felt something shift, not forgiveness, not closure, just a thread pulling through without breaking. I wasn't the woman who raised her, but I was the one standing in this room, fastening these buttons in this moment, and that, somehow, was enough. The final button clicked gently into place. She adjusted her shoulders, straightened her spine, and for a breath, our reflections aligned, not perfectly, but just enough to say, we were here. She didn't thank me, and I didn't wait for it. She simply nodded once before turning toward the door, toward the ceremony, the guests, and the vows I wouldn't hear from the front row, while I followed behind at a quiet distance that didn't intrude but didn't disappear. As she stepped into the courtyard and the music began, no one noticed me standing there, and I understood, without sorrow, that I wasn't meant to be seen. I sat in the front row, just a few seats from the aisle, close enough to see her eyes as she walked, not because I had been named, but because she had saved that place without needing to explain it to anyone. Her mother, the one who raised her, sat in the front with quiet pride. Her father stood beside the aisle, hands folded behind his back. But when the moment came, and she walked down between them, her eyes scanned the crowd, not searching, just noticing, and when they landed on me, she didn't smile. She just looked. And in that look was everything she didn't need to say, because even if I wasn't in the photo, I was still in the frame. I stayed through the ceremony. I listened to the vows. I watched her smile. And when the applause rose like sunlight over the courtyard, I didn't slip away through any side door. I remained where I was, at the edge, but not unseen, among strangers who didn't know my name, yet beside the one who finally did. Guests mingled, laughter scattered into the garden, and the air filled with celebration. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't need to, because she had looked for me. She had held my eyes, and that alone made me belong. The ceremony was over. The guests had begun to scatter, voices spilling into the courtyard, shoes clicking softly on stone, petals crushed gently underfoot. People laughed as they gathered gifts, lifted heels, slipped jackets back over shoulders. And I stood by the archway near the parked cars, not hidden, not waiting, just there, as if my presence were a part of the evening's final light. I hadn't moved since the last note of music faded, not because I didn't know where to go, but because something in me was waiting, not for a moment, but for a choice. The kind of choice that can only come from the one who no longer needs to choose in secret. She emerged with her new husband beside her, framed by lanterns and soft applause. Her dress caught the glow of every camera, her smile wide but not rehearsed. She was surrounded, arms linked, cheeks kissed, voices calling her name. But then, she paused, she turned, not quickly, not dramatically, but deliberately, and began walking away from the group. For a heartbeat, I thought she had forgotten something. Then I saw her eyes, and they were already on me. She walked directly toward me, cutting through the chatter and flash without looking back. No detour, no hesitation, only the steady pull of a path she had already chosen in silence. When she reached me, she didn't offer an explanation or ask for permission. She simply stepped in and wrapped her arms around me, not with caution, not with the politeness people use for fragile things, but with a quiet, unshakable fullness that said, "You were never too far to return to." Her head rested softly against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of her bouquet pressing between us, the stems slightly bent, as if even the flowers understood they had to make room for something older, deeper, finally spoken. Her hands clutched the fabric of my coat, holding on with the ease of someone who had stopped pretending there was nothing to hold. And then, in a voice just low enough for no one else to hear, she said, "You've always been my mother, too." There were eyes on us and conversations that paused mid-sentence, but I didn't hear a single sound louder than the voice she had just used, because she had said it. I had heard it, and for the first time, I didn't have to be the one to let go first. I didn't cry, because I didn't need to. The moment had already said everything I had once hoped to hear aloud. My hands found her back slowly, deliberately, not to keep her here, but to let her know I had stayed. Behind her, I caught the gaze of the woman who had raised her, still standing, still steady, watching without intrusion. She didn't look away. She didn't step forward. She simply offered a smile so full, so sure of its place. It told me everything I needed. We were not rivals. We were roots. When the driver opened the car door, she stepped back, but didn't walk away just yet. She turned to me again, took my hand, and held it in both of hers, not like a goodbye, but like a signature, not like a closing, but like a start. And in her eyes, I saw something more than acceptance. I saw continuation. I didn't follow her into the car. I didn't need to, but this time, as the door clicked shut and the ribbons lifted with the breeze, I didn't feel like I was being left behind. I wasn't a chapter she had closed. I wasn't her past. I was her mother, and she had said so, not in secret, not in shadow, but with her voice, her hands, and her whole, unhidden heart. The courtyard began to clear, the sky dipping slowly toward evening, and still I stood there, not out of habit, not because I didn't know how to walk away, but because for the first time, I was standing in the right place, under the right name, in the right part of her story. I hadn't raised her. I hadn't watched her first steps or her first heartbreak, but she had returned, fully, freely, and without condition. And in doing so, she had written me back into a life that had never truly closed its door. And so, after all those years of learning how to wait without reaching, how to hope without asking, I finally stepped out of the shadow, not to watch her leave, but to stand beside her as she became someone else's home,